working with a simple concept of how to create the lines that take us beyond perspective, beyond shape, beyond form, into texture. How to create textures with pencil or ink lines, making sure you can select which type of pen and for which type of line, and have a little more consciousness of why I'm doing this, how I'm going to get in there and create that illusion that will make people go, wow, that looks exactly like what I would envision it, with broken, simple applications of line. The variations of how some of these lines are broken down when we are talking about, as I said, sky, background sky, clouds, vegetation, trees, rock, clothing, not just skin, the person, but the clothing, the type of clothing. We could tell if it's leather or velvet. And it is amazing how you create that kind of illusion, that kind of texture difference with the same exact tool. One of the things I want you to really focus on for today as well is one of my biggest recommendations, which is, and I'm doing it right now, squinting as much as you can. And go ahead and try it. Because when we talk about simplifying the line, we begin by simplifying structure, and then the next thing would be the light. So notice how with the same exact application of lines, there's this beautiful contrast, not just the perspective in space of this subject, but the light, the way light is affecting it, the way the light and the shadows, cast shadows and coarse shadows, everything is applied that really just gives us the full range of the illusion. Let me give you one more. This, an interior, and again, it's a little more simplified. This one's not an etching, this one's an ink drawing. So you can really see the breakdown of some of these lines and the patterns in which they are developed. So I really want you to take a close look at these. I know it's the best you can. The ideal way is to actually go see them in a museum. And we do have some beautiful ones here at the North Carolina, which opened again already. So that's one option. And you can always go to the curators. And if it's not on display, you can maybe arrange to see some of their etchings. And you would be looking at 15th, 16th, 17th century, 18th century. You're still looking at some of the greatest. Here's one more. I'm sorry, did I skip one? Yes, this one. So here I want you to realize, again, notice that you can begin to identify, oh, look at that. I see the patterns. And now as well, squinting, I see all the effects of light and shadow and how some are a little bit harsher, some are a little bit, in the mid-tone. And then it's the space between these lines that creates those patterns as well. I'm not just looking at directions of the lines. And one final one. This goes from an ink drawing to an etching, but look at just the amazing, as a little difference from the one we just saw where you see more parallel, straight lines that are organized and arranged in just different settings. Here, it's hard to see it where you can actually read that type of parallel hatching. And you notice that it is really just broken down into some squiggly, almost that circular pattern, reinforced and then overlaid to create, again, that magnificent, not just the perspective, the structure, the illusion of space, but again, the textures where you can see what's brick, what's rock, what's marble, what's vegetation or people in it. And then, of course, how all of that relates to the light. And that simple exercise of squinting shows you where you would actually place most of that attention to. So this is the one we're going to be working on today, the Coliseum. And it's just a nice, beautiful structure. We're not going to, and we are going to touch a little bit on the perspective. How would you begin this drawing? And then, of course, we're going to focus on how to create that illusion of space, form, and then deliver some of that texture. So it's not as complex as you would think. I created one of these as well, so you guys could see the comparison and make it a little bit easier in terms of the squinting. This would make it a little bit easier. It's all there. Where are my lights and darks? You can see them right away. So we'll have that at hand as well. But this is the one we're going to work on today. And before we get started with that, what I wanted to show you first is a quick rendering of how we can begin to consider our subject. So we're sitting there. We have our sketchbook on our lap. We're looking at this beautiful perspective of the Coliseum. So we have our horizon line. And I want to consider, okay, where would I start? Which of the methods that we've worked on should I consider going with my blind contour? So should I just render and try to find the edges of the contour and be able to sketch my drawing starting from this point? That would be one option, of course. We've done that many, many times. What about if and this is the one we're going to look at today. What if, let me just turn down the opacity, and I hope you guys can see this okay. And I'm going back to this. Okay, so what I wanted you guys to just think for today, and this is not the main objective of today, I just wanted to present it to you. What I wanted you guys to begin to see is, imagine this, and I'm doing my best here to not trying to rush, but if I were to actually consider for a second what this structure would look in space in its most basic form, I might be forced to see it as something like this, which if you guys can kind of tell, it would be that cube in space. And to make it a little bit easier, these lines, you kind of would not see them in the background because they're, you know, our back view and our side views. So you would have this, and this is what I'm just trying to get you guys to. Where would my starting point be? This, can I visualize this? And then from here, can I visualize, let me switch color. From this structure, which I can see this massive three-dimensional cube, can I visualize what happens inside of it? So I'm seeing, and again, this would go all the way through the back as a cylinder. And if you guys could see that, it would kind of follow in this way. So if I get rid of this, now I'm left with that. So if I can't see this first, this image that you're looking at right now as my first step, I would have to go one backwards, which would be the cube. And inside that cube, I need to be able to see this cylinder. And this has to happen before, way before I try or begin to do any of the details. And we know that, right? We always go from biggest to smallest, from simplest to more complex. And that's, of course, step number one. So when confronted with this, and I just want to show you a couple more that I did. So we had the cube, and then to that cube, we added, oops, sorry. To that cube, we added the cylinder. Then to that cylinder, we would add the verticals that begin to create that grid. And you guys could see them here. And they would continue, sorry. If you could see them, there's divisions between the columns. The next one would be right there. And then the one comes after would be right there, and on and on. It goes all the way around, giving me the pattern and creating that grid that would then allow me to see this. And I'm going to get rid of everything else really quick, because once we're there, we can begin to focus on how to create this illusion, which would be the likeness, and how it relates to the perspective of the form. How am I seeing it in space? So we started with just the nice, and notice that this is not a vertical. It's at an angle because we're looking at this from below. So we have a lower, we're looking upwards to it. So eventually these two lines would become our vanishing point. If this structure were taller, imagine when you look up at a building and you see it all the way and they merge together. So these lines would all the way, if you just keep going, would eventually become a vanishing point, right? So notice that they're not verticals. So already you have a hint of the perspective. But these are the ones that I want you to find, be able to find, and there's clues there where the columns give you that nice little change up from the arc to the column. You see the actual angle. And that's why I chose this one. So the next thing is you're looking at a page of lines, and I prepared a couple of them. And again, I want to, how this sketchbook is turning out with our sky studies. And I started this one before because this is the original one for those of you who've been with us on all these trips from Venice to Paris to Santorini, and then to London, and now to Italy, to Rome. So developing this sketchbook and everything you do to put it together, and the nice idea of these series, to be able to, at the end, look back and say, oh, wow, look at all this work and how it's coming together. This is one of those pages that I would love for you guys to introduce to your sketchbook. Now, we're not going to do this whole thing. This would take us the whole class. I just want to break down a few of them. I will send you the image of this one, but I do want to switch here and show you close-ups of it. Okay, so there we are. So this is a different camera that's going to allow me to show you what these actually look like. So this would be trying to really get close, and I'm not comparing myself to the artist we just saw, but if we could get close, and I'm talking about these images that we saw earlier, ideally you would want to get this close and see how those lines were patterned. So here we have parallel grids. It's called a parallel hatch. This one's a vertical. This one's a parallel hatch. And if you notice, for example, here, where I kind of break the line and I could put them pretty evenly at the same distance, knowing that I could put them closer or wider from each other, right? That would create a different look. Here we have a horizontal pattern. And again, there's some break in those patterns in that hatch. This would be a diagonal. And again, I created a nice, just interesting look for this hatch here, where you have left to right, right to left, diagonals. And again, all of them in the same pattern, parallel hatch. The only difference here is the direction of them. So imagine how many of these you can create. That's why I was saying earlier that today I'm not going to teach you anything new. You've done all of these. The idea today is to really know when and how you're going to choose to use them. And if you have seen one that you think, oh, I've never done that one, then we're going to test it out. So this is called the basket weave. And what it is a combination of vertical, horizontal, diagonal. And again, they don't have to be so rigid, so organized. They could be more broken or more organic in a way, which would depend on the texture that you're trying to create. Here we begin to have the cross hatching. So again, same thing. We have verticals or parallels, and these are the ones I'm going to show you today. So we have the cross hatch, which is very familiar. I'm sure you've heard of it before. You see it almost everywhere. We have the flat X hatch, which is almost a cross hatch, but it creates as you notice, it creates a different texture, and you could do tons of variations with it. We talked about this one before, the chicken scratch or the dash, which, as you can tell, it's pretty much just kind of like stabbing at the paper, that gesture kind of mark, and it's almost creating a little bit of a rhythm with the looks of a parallel hatch that we had here before, only a little more, I don't want to say disorganized, but more free. And then here, more rhythmic, more going with the form, not as parallel in terms of how the lines follow each other. Here we have a continuous line. So this is what we've been doing with some of our contour drawings where you don't lift the pen. And this line just follows the form, creating the texture. Obviously, you can see it's more organic. It could maybe be used for trees, plants, and it is actually mostly used for that. But you could see this in a portrait, maybe in a figure. And again, it's your imagination that's going to say, okay, this is the line I need for the rendering of this form. This one, which I love, Scumbling, it's not necessarily the continuous, as you can tell, but it is very continuous. Pretty much a continuous line that does break. You can see that there are breaks here and there in some of these lines, but notice the direction shifts from one area to the next. And this might be the most free form and probably the most used. And I think the one that, just along with cross hatching and maybe parallel hatching, one of them would be your biggest toolbox. That's why we're going to look at those independently. So this one would be your top 3 lines to use. This one's ripples. And again, it's almost like feathers, where you have that action that you're applying into the line. You have other ones, and I just added these to complete the page. This is a combination of line and dots. So you have a little bit of somewhat parallel hatching. In this case, it's vertical, but it could be any direction, and it's combined with dash or dots. This is stippling, and it's just tons and tons of little dots coming together. So they're little, you could actually make them points, dots, or little dashes, tiny little dashes, but not as big that they become, where are you? These, right? Because now you're working with dashes. If you want that look, and this one is your ultimate. This is the way you can literally create, and think of the concept. If you're using dots and lines, this would be, you could create any texture, any look with this one. And it is a fact, because dots create lines. So if you wanted to create any type of line or texture with dots, you can. So stippling is one you see very, very much, but it is probably the most patience demanding, most time consuming. It could take hours and hours. This one probably was a good 10 minutes, 15 minutes in there. And if you want to do it right. So then we have variations of these, which is, for example, you have your curved. So you have nice, in this variation, I'm doing somewhat of a parallel that opens wide and narrows at some edges. We have loops, C's, and I'm talking about the letter C or O's. So if you noted here, we're looping somewhat of a parallel hatch. Now we don't have horizontals or diagonals or verticals. They're loops. And we're broken, they're not continuous. So I did loops like this. Then I did here the letter C, and you can clearly see it. And you would automatically see what you could be using this for. Your imagination tells you, ooh, I see lizards, scales, maybe some type of, and I'm thinking of these, what do you call those? like very thick. It's textile, like woven. I forget what it's called, but like wool. Yeah, that's what I was thinking, wool. And then here you have little O's, circular loops. And then here at the very end, I said, okay, what happens when you put them continuous? So this is like a continuous O or C, and it becomes more of a squiggly. But it is very different from your scumbling, as you can see. So that's another variation. This one here would be, and I call it the zigzags. And to me, they look like letter M's, just all put together. A lot of M's, different variations, sharp angles or round angles, different variations in the space or the size. And then the other one would be letter U's. So it's actually like M's or V's or U's or N's, really, if you put them all together. So if you're going upwards, you have the letter M or N. And if you're going downwards, you're doing the letter U or V. And that's the variations of them. And then here we have a grid. So it starts with this. Notice that before we did cross-hatching, generally you do not do cross-hatching with verticals or horizontals. These lines, if you notice, they're at an angle. So it's like a 5, 10, 15 degree angle. If you're working at a 30-degree angle, then the one that comes across it is going to be just 5 or 10 degrees off. Here we have horizontals, verticals, and here diagonals that are perpendicular. So you notice it creates a very different look, but a look that you sometimes need. And then this would be the broken. So it becomes like the letter, I see it as the letter H, but again, it's a broken grid. And here it becomes like a little more broken would be the letter T, like not well, some capital T's, you can see them there, and some just little crosses. Today I'm going to be working with this ink pen. Okay, there we are. And so I'm just going to do a cross hatch. So what I was saying, even if I do a vertical line, what I want to do is begin by doing a parallel. And again, the distance between these lines could be very close, almost touching each other, or a little bit wider, depending on the texture that you're trying to recreate. And you notice the difference. So what I did, vertical lines. With a cross hatch, what I want to do is find this single line that I did vertically. And what I want to do is just come across it as close as I can at an angle. Did you see that? So when I come across them, I want to maintain that angle. And automatically, I begin to see, okay, there's the pattern. And I also want to maintain the distance of the lines. You can actually play with that. So if my previous grid, and let's do one like that. If my previous grid was wider lines, again, vertical, what happens if I cross hatch it with just a tiny little angle, but these lines are way closer to each other. So it's not the same distance. All these variations, this is what makes this type of drawing so amazing, because every single one of you using the same technique, maybe even the same pen on the same paper, will create completely different patterns because of the infinity of variations. So that's the first one I wanted to show you. And the variations on this are very simple. It's going to be the angle of the line. So you can think of a 360 degrees, you can do that line. And then the crossing line is 5 to 10 degrees off of that, okay? So if you're doing, once again, we did vertical. If you're doing horizontal lines, and this one's a little tougher for me, what you do not want to do is cross-hatch this vertically, because you'll be creating a grid. So what would be the angle for a cross-hatch that is a horizontal? Obviously, it's just a couple degrees off. Next one we're going to look at is the scumbling. So for scumbling, as I said, it's a continuous line, and I have to think of something in order to do this, because otherwise it feels like, so I'm thinking of a tree. I'm actually looking out my window, and I'm just literally contour drawing every single little leaf that I can pretend to see, because it's so hard to actually capture. And notice that they could be a little more round. They could be a little more sharp in angle. The beauty of this is it could go any which direction, and it could go obviously in any length. So this scumbling is a little sizier. It's a little bit bigger, which will give you a different type of, it could cross over itself, creating somewhat of a grid, a crosshatch, which is not technically a crosshatch, just in the look of going over its own line, it's still a scumbling. And once again, the variations for this are infinite, because the direction can change instantaneous. It could go any which direction, in any which length, at any angle, and it's very freeing. One tip that I recommend when doing scumbling, try it with your left hand. Try it with your left hand, and you'll see how, wow, how freeing that is. And then the last one that I wanted to try with you guys today. So I mentioned those three: the parallel hatch, the cross hatch, and the scumbling. So for the parallel hatch, it's basically where you start everything. And that is just creating variations. In this case, I'm doing vertical. I'm gonna do, and I'm thinking again, degrees, 15 degrees. And I could do variations where I break them, and I'm just putting them next to each other. Let's go a little more with a horizontal and way longer. So they get a little bit squigglier. They're not necessarily completely straight. And some people ask me, can I use ruler? Absolutely. It is absolutely fine. And I've seen architects actually use that technique a lot. So I'm saying water automatically here. So that squiggly line, as I try to create a parallel hatch, comes in extremely handy. Just to close out the last few, because I think it would be helpful today, I mentioned stippling, just adding the dots, and then you can really saturate an area. So not by making them bigger, meaning this way. What you want to do is saturate the area. And notice how different this one looks from this one. And I don't know if you could tell that. Let's see if you could zoom exactly right there. There you go. The difference is huge. If I were to just color in a dot like this, or if I were to stipple one of these like that. And then again, you can go any which way, and you have to work sort of in quadrants here. So I want to saturate this area. So you have to have sort of a rhythmic pattern, and the decision on how and why you're adding saturation there. One technique that I use is, if I were, for example, to use stippling for this little square here, what I usually do is I think in like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s, or 1, 2, 3. 5 is easier because it's just faster. So I go, in many ways, I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I repeat that, putting them in the middle of them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I look for the middle of those 4 or 5s. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s. And as I notice that it's already almost there. And as I get smaller and smaller, I just do it around that one dot. And I put 5 little dots around that one dot. And I just, again, go around 5s. And without overthinking it, it's not like I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 every single time. It's just I'm creating a rhythm to create that saturation. And there it is. And then last one, which is going to be zigzags or loops. This one you have to be very careful when using because it could get very loose in terms of, since you don't have to think too much and your hand is just moving at a rhythm that you're used to because of writing, you will just fill in areas. So this zigzagging, and I'm thinking about the letter M. Let me show you again here. So you have the letter M, and then what you're doing is you're doing it over and over, but at a sharper angle. So M, 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 or V, 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 or W. And that, again, in any angle, is the one that we want to be cautious. We tend to use it a little too much because we want to speed up. And that's when I see it. When you just want to finish, you want to rush an area and fill it up with lines, we tend to just color them in or just zigzag it. And these types of drawings do require a lot of patience. I wanted you guys to test these lines. So I'm going to switch here. And in some area where you were maybe practicing, I want you guys to draw a cylinder, maybe more like a tambourine. So we have, it's not a vertical. I'm putting it at an angle, and I'm actually exaggerating the angle. And from here, I'm thinking in a cube, so I might be better off doing the other side. Maybe that's how you do a cylinder. And from there, I'm going to visualize and create the angle of that loop. So I kind of give myself somewhat of a little ghost line in order to create that. And then what do I do with the bottom one? Is it straight, or does it come forward, or does it loop upward? So I don't think, think of this as a cube. When you're looking at a cube from below, do you see the bottom of it? No. Does it come towards you? Yes. So it's a little more vertical, but I'm adding a little bit of curvature, just a little bit. Okay, so there I have a cylinder. Now, using some of these techniques that we just looked at with lines, I want you guys to pick a side where the light is coming from, and simply, I'm going to create a parallel hatch here. And I'm going to make my lines just a little bit wider, more distant from each other as they go across. Let me zoom in for you guys. So can you see that? Okay, and I'm going to cross hatch it. Very delicate angle. I do not want to create that grid. And I'm looking at the distance between those lines, making them really tight on this side. And as I come across with my crosshatch, and again, remember, you could do this with pencil or any ink pen, any type of point, nib, even brush. There's some amazing artists that do this with ink and brush. And I plan to maybe in the future have one of those classes where we actually just do this type of drawing with nib and ink and apply ink and brush. So as I do this, the first cross hatch, can you begin to see a little bit of the illusion of light on it? Let me go over it again, because that's the beauty of the cross hatch. It's not just a 1, 2. It could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 layers I've seen. Now that would be pushing it. Usually it would be 3 or 4. So if I apply a third, let me show it to you here. If this was my first line, then my second line, and I'm going to exaggerate a little, would be this one, right? And we're looking really, really close up. So then my third one, ideally, would go this way. And then if I did a fourth, it would be probably this way, and a fifth would be going across this way. And as you pattern those lines and you add just 5 to 10 degrees to that angle, you'll see what they can create. So I'm going to start at the top this time, and I could still see the angle. And this is the area where I really want to emphasize more of that dark shadow area. And the key here is to see the angle of the lines and the distance between those lines. Not just the angle, but the distance as I come across. And just take it even lighter, because it's not necessarily the full line that you want to do. And I think I need one more just area of cross hatch that is going to add just a little extra angle to this. And I could do areas, begin to do small areas of saturation with the same cross hatch pattern that would identify this and begin to give it that structure. So if you look at that, okay, I'm pretty happy with it. It does create the illusion. And this is before we add anything else to it. So there's a figure in space. I just added a horizon line here, and I could go to Scumbling to maybe add, and I'm rushing here. One of the things that I say about Scumbling always is the slower you go, the better, because your line really has that I like to compare it to speech. So it has that nice tone. Not like you're talking like this. It's kind of the same. I read it as the same. Fast talker or slow, clear talker. Slow down your Scumbling. So imagine right there what we could do and begin to add maybe a cast shadow here in this area and maybe a little bit of extra lines here. So all of a sudden, you're creating that illusion. And that, I think, is a great exercise. I'm going to do one last thing that is going to get us way ahead, but where we're headed today, which is to all of this line work. I barely need to add anything else to it. But as I did here, notice I just added one brush stroke of color. And I did it on the light side. I could do it on the dark side. And it resolves it. It literally would not need. But because of what we've been doing on our sketchbooks, I am going to recommend that we apply the lines with effort where you feel you do not need to add any color. But if you do, it would be something like this. Just a touch of color that really just emphasizes the line. Okay, so if you're ready, now we go to our sketchbook. And I did one here just to test the time, how long it would take. And we are going to be very close. Again, depending on how much detail you add, I decided to go a little more and again, it's a sketch, but it does have a little of that going for realism somewhat. I could have exaggerated more some of the lines, and I'm going to recommend we do that. Actually, this is the one I was considering for us to do today, but because of the multiplicity, they had that vegetation, trees, and this is going to be your homework. So I'm going to email this later on today for you guys to, if you wanted to add a second page to your sketchbook, this would be the one. And I also added some additional, a breakdown of how those lines work. So I'll add this image in there as well. Okay, so we are going to the Coliseum. Now I might make this one a 2-page. And I'm gonna have to deal with that little crease in the middle. We call it the gutter. And I'm hoping you guys can see okay. Move a little more this way. See how far I can go. There we go. Okay, so to start our drawing, many things can happen here. You can start with a pencil and then you can ink over it. But I would not recommend wasting tons of time adding detail if you're doing a pencil layout to then ink. because you'll be doing double the work, and you could lose some quality lines. So you make a decision. Do I go with pencil or do I go with ink? And if your intention is to go with ink, which I will, then a quick pencil sketch should be very light. So I'm going to be using a 2H. And this, again, I do just as I would if I were there, plein air. I'm going to minimize this just a tiny little bit more. There we go. And then consider what the composition is going to look on my page, because I might be adding a little bit, a couple of elements. And one of those things was I added an image, which was a tree, a Roman pine. I believe in the email, I added an image of a Roman pines, yes. And if not, let me go ahead and add it here so you guys could see it. Take me 1 second. And we are in Rome. And there we are. So my idea would be to create a composition because of the what's missing on this in this photo, which is just a shot of the Coliseum that is smack right in the center. What I want to do, if you could visualize, is add some trees right on this side over here. So my composition is going to look, it's going to look a little more with the Colosseum more on this page, maybe going just about a quarter into this page, and then have something for the background with some trees that would be just as interesting in maybe size and comparison, because they're not going to be as big. If anything, they'll look somewhat like this over here, and play it off of that. And you guys could consider doing that. Maybe put the trees on this side. But because I've been there and I remember these beautiful trees, and I did sketch them actually, I would want something like this. And maybe they're not there in actuality, but they're nearby. So this is the composition that I'm going to be considering, if you guys could see that. That's why I'm going to work on a 2-page. I am going to do a little quick pencil structure, a ghost line, to give me just a sense of if I have the right sizes and where I want to begin to lay down my ink lines. And then we're going to just focus on which types of lines and how we're going to begin to render. I always recommend, for a drawing like this, still push yourself towards an economy of line. The one thing you do want to be good at is focusing on trying to capture this, which is your lights and darks. No matter what type of line you use or how much of it, this is where it's going to happen. And again, disregard the background in this image, the notan, which is so dark. And I could not get it with a clear background, which would really showcase more the lights and darks. And notice that they are minimal. It's going to be mostly in how we capture those arches. Okay, so here we go. Now, again, we did that cylinder. And the first thing I would look here on my page would be, where am I going to place my base? And maybe just as well as the composition, maybe I want to add a little more distance between me and the Coliseum, so I can maybe add a couple more people here. And one of the tips that I've always given you is, when you see crowds of people, the horizon line is literally right through their eyes. So if you see people, notice that all the people you see in this image, everybody lines up and their heads are all in one straight line. That is your horizon line. So my horizon line is going to be right about here. And I know it's going to go maybe deeper to this side. And here we have some of those pre-planning decisions that could take a couple of seconds, and it's always important. Take that extra couple of seconds, minutes even. There's a great quote that I saw recently that I wanted to share with you guys. And it's, let me see, I could actually pop it up here because I had it ready for you guys. And it's about good habits. And it says, good habits directly affect the outcome of your drawings. Spend more time looking before you start to draw. And it's an amazing, probably your greatest technique is how you see, how you look at things. So this is a great habit to develop, which is spend more time looking, and then decipher, what am I looking at? What am I looking for? And what is my idea to bring it to the paper? So as I mentioned before, because of the previous drawing I did, we can actually use our blocking technique, our angle siding, and I'm checking the angle of the side, and it gives me this angle here. I might want to exaggerate it just a little more to give it a little more kind of drama, but obviously I know that that is going to switch up the angles. So it's not much. Just checking it again. And I noticed that, yeah, I added a couple of maybe 5 degrees to that angle just to sharpen that. And maybe what I'll do is, as I block the top, which should be here, I'm going to add a little more curvature. So this would bring me a little bit higher at the front, and then that edge that comes straight down would bring me right into here. And I'm already way too big. This is gonna, and again, this is me getting ahead of myself. So this should have been way smaller, and that's why I wanted to do a pencil. So not to confuse myself, I'm gonna erase this top one and make this a little bit smaller, because I want this proportion for this Coliseum to end somewhere over here. So if I measure, and I take a quick measurement of the height and compare it to, it's just a little bit, so this height, it's just a little bit over double. So I would put it right about here, and I almost had that. And that's kind of what I would want. I'm gonna check the angle on this side. And just, again, I have to visualize, is this kind of the composition that I want? So I could add these trees right here. I kind of feel like I need a little more space for these trees to have the look, but they might be smaller. So that could be one way. And I think it will have to be that. So then the next thing would be to create my cylinder. Now this line ends here, but visualizing, I continue it. I mentioned I want to exaggerate this, so noticing the angle, I want to make sure it goes way higher, and it obviously comes around right to here. Although we do not see this, what I'm doing is I'm creating the basic, simplest basic form that then I can carve out. So all of this area here, it will not be there. That's why I'm making my lines way lighter. And now if I see this is literally halfway, my halfway point, and it almost takes me straight up. So all I have to do is check the angle, and that angle would give it to me right there. Now I was going to suggest pencil, color pencil, ink pens, and any type of ink pen. I didn't have time, and I wanted to do a quick thumbnail with a non-permanent ink pen, one of the fountain pens that I've been using. And that would make this look very interesting because of that old look that it would kind of bleed out and wash when you add color. So that's another one I will be doing, maybe with a different, in Rome, maybe with different ruins. Trying with an ink pen that bleeds, that washes. That would be a suggestion as well. But if you want to try it here, that would be great. Obviously, your lines would not be as saturated because then it would just be, I don't want to say a mess, but hard to control. You would be focusing a little more on the wash. Okay, so here we go. Now, we got to this part, and the next thing I mentioned was now that we have our cylinder, and now that we have the main angles, the main lines, I'm going to begin to look at, and you can actually count them. And I did at the top. One of the divisions that I want to find is the angle of these perspectives, finding the halfway point. And I'm doing this with the educated guess kind of sense, where I'm cutting this in half because I see that I do want to match the angle at the top. As the levels get lower and lower, notice how the curve gets flatter and flatter to the point where the bottom one almost looks like it's coming towards us. And it should, in a way. It should, because that is the way it's set up. But we want to keep it a little more in this stage at a flatter angle. And then, of course, I divide these in half, maintaining the angle at the top, making sure I get that halfway, and then the same down here. Because I could see very easily, I could identify 4 levels that I could divide in this structure, and just making sure I see the angle of it. The curvature at the top, less, little less, almost none, almost backwards. There we are. And some of these lines obviously would continue. So you would bring it all the way over here, and that gives me this edge. And this one, as I notice, see, it should be probably even less angle than that because it curves all the way around this side. So here is where what we think we see and what is actually there should be very careful. And all you have to do is check it. Check it before you lay it down. Don't trust and just go with it. You can actually make a quick, simple angle sighting check, a bit of triangulation by adding a second point and comparing the angle. And I know these are very subtle, but I hope you can see the difference. Okay, so the next step, and here's where we begin to focusing on this angle that I added on this edge here. I'm gonna have to count arches so I see very clearly 1, 2, and I'm counting the bottom ones that bring me right to the middle one here. And I'm seeing this one as the middle because it's facing straight forward. I could see through it. So I'm starting at the edge and I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and including the one in the middle, 10. Does everybody agree with me? Does anybody see less or more? And what I'm counting is not necessarily the arches. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I see 9 and 10. I see a column between these last two where you barely see any arch at all, and they're completely turned away from us. So if I see 10 and this one that starts right here, I want to see if I can figure out a way where I'm going to be dividing these, and is there a halfway point? And obviously it's way larger in the area because as they turn away from us, they get smaller and smaller. So if I were to count, if I were just to put a line halfway between here and here and put 5 arches in this segment, 5 arches over here, it is going to look way off. But if you do this, if you find this center one here, and I'm just going to add a line right through the middle of it. And what I'm using is this edge that comes down on the outer level that is kind of broken off. It goes almost right to the middle of this arc here. This arch that goes straight up. That would be my number 1. And as they begin to turn, I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the 5th one Intuitively, I want to put it here, but I want to make a measurement by looking at the image, and I'm going all the way to the outer edge of the fifth, and then comparing that from there to the outer. Woof, that is big difference. So what it gave me is the measurement from the middle of this art to the fifth here, to the edge of it was here. And then as I measured, it was almost double. That's amazing. And that's how much it turns. So it would put it right about here. And remember, if you want to, if you're in doubt, in this case where we're sketching, exaggerating it always some would actually help you instead of hurting you. Going the safer way, like if we wanted to, because it's halfway, put it in the middle, would actually hurt you more. So the next thing I'm going to look is at the lines and how the angle of it begins to straighten out. So in the middle, notice that it will be completely vertical. But as I turn one column towards the edge, I got to go from here, and I'm going to end up here. So the angle of these lines is going to be shifting just a couple degrees until it becomes completely vertical. So I'm going to make a check. And obviously from one to the one next to it is too close. So I'm going to go back to that fifth arch that we measured to, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the column that's right next to it, I'm going to try to get a measurement, an angle sighting of that column that goes straight up. And I'm going to try to get the angle. And that is exactly what I would have. It feels absolutely right. So now I have that measurement. Now I have the angle of it. So I can make variations very easily from here to the edge, matching the angle of these lines, and from here to my vertical. And all I have to do now is find a way to divide them. So from here on out, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I notice that the last two, they're almost overlapping. So to divide them into halves would give me 4. So they're going to have to be, and again, they're getting smaller and smaller in size. I get a measurement at half, and I'm going to go just a little bit to the right and left of it to get 2 measurements there. And I'm going to do the same here now, just to get that, so I'm not confused. And if you are here, you can add as many lines as you want, knowing that the count of these 10 that we did here could easily be halfway, with this as our halfway 5, finding a way to divide in halves, which would only give you 4. You could actually do halves again. That would give you the 4. And then move those as they get away smaller, add 1 in between those just for the 5th. And it is an easier way to get that measurement than trying to spot it and angle transfer it, really. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add a line here, which gives me half, and I'm going to add 2 more right in the middle of this one and right in the middle of this one. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, knowing that these lines are going to have to shift, opening up room for one final one. So I'm sticking with this line, and I'm going to make this one a little bit less, making it a little mark at the bottom, just a little bit darker. That's 1, 2. And now I'm moving just a little bit left of that. 3, 4, 5. So I just put some tiny little markers, and I'll show you that here. Actually, that is as much, knowing that I have a grid that cut it in 4, I moved and rearranged by just pushing one line to the left, to the right, and one a little bit to the left as they push away to the side and they become smaller. And again, they become smaller just visually. So I'm going to do the same here, knowing that this is my middle, is in half, and they do get bigger. I'm going to make this area smaller and cut that in half and cut this one in half. Now, to add the fifth, this would be 1. Keep this one there and add a marker here. So this would be 1. And I can actually begin to, so this would be 2. Add a line here, keep it there. It's 1, 2. Move it a little bit to the left, I'm sorry, to the right. That would be 3, 4, 5. And it should match, again, as I did the angles, it should give me the angle and the distance with enough confidence that I could follow it in ink. And if I'm not 100% sure at this stage, I could still begin to add, and notice that I did a little bit. Just finishing up here so you can see it clear. I added a couple of little arches there. See that? Just to give me a little bit of a better visual reference. Am I anywhere near? They might be a little bit lower, smaller, but that's going to help me out a lot. And then I'm going to do the same, the opposite direction. Obviously, they get a little simpler here because we don't see the half of this one. We have this angle, and I'm going to count 1, 2. On this side, I see 12. And again, the last 2 I'm counting as just the columns or the gaps of it. So with 12, it's actually a little bit easier because we could literally go 1 measurement from here. And I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm counting from here, my center, to the edge of the 6th, and then comparing that. And once again, this one becomes almost half on this size. So as I have this here, this one must be a lot larger here. So this right here comes 1.5. So that should be it right there. Matching the angle of the side. And then these I could just divide in halves. And remember, the angles of these become straighter and straighter as they get towards the middle, which is straight vertical. So I'm going to consider that as they get further away, they become smaller and smaller. Half of that, and half of this. And that gives me 1, 4, 5, 6, 7. All I have to do now that I have 6, these are going to get way smaller. As I go to the edges, move the same pattern and cut these in half. So I have 3, 6. They would pretty much split in the middle. And these lines are very tricky here because there's going to be, doing a count again, 1, what seems to be 1, and I don't want to get too caught up in the detail back here, but just to be, kind of give you a sense of accuracy if you were really to want to do this, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Almost in this space, you have 5 arches here. So how do you get close to that accuracy in terms of spacing, well, the difference is so minimal. I'm just going to add these lines, and there it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, and add a fifth here that I know is just a tiny little bit larger. So from this spot, we have 6, and now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All I have to do is the space. Same thing I did on the other side. Give myself the markers and move this one just this much to the right, and this one just a little bit to the left, creating that extra edge for the 6th. And there we are. Okay, so this actually was a little more precise than I actually would encourage usually. We're at a sketch stage, and again, you want to have a nice, good drawing, but you could definitely use so many of the different methods, and I would actually recommend for my style of what I like more, you guys having just a good understanding of what the perspective looks like, what my main markers, my main landmark points are going to be, which starting again from the cube, making sure I get the cylinder, and then division of the main lines. I think the main lines here are the 4 levels that we could see, and then obviously some of these lines. But you do not have to be this precise. I just wanted to go over some of these to show you if you were ever wanting to go this way, which is more of an architectural type drawing, you would easily find, and we have done this before, the type of analysis to get you to have a good structure. So I'm going with my ink pen, and I just want to see really quick. For this one, I have been using the Faber-Castell Pitt pens, and I want to show you guys. I got these, which are the sepia, and they are amazing. And for this type of sketching, I am going to recommend these as well to test them out. Because why? There is a big difference in contrast when working with pen that is a black, dark black line on white paper, and then your sepia. The difference in contrast, when you begin to add color, could actually benefit you. Now, it's a matter of taste. I am going to make this one because I have done several others in black ink. I'm going to make this one with sepia ink. So from here on out, what I want to do is, my approach at this point, it's a matter of style, how you decide to render the detail here. And we looked at different lines. The one thing in my mind is, how am I going to create that rendering the texture of the columns and the rock and the marble and the cracks. And what I don't want to lose sight of is maintaining the lights and darks that I want, putting a little more emphasis on the cross hatching or scumbling or any type of line pattern that I'm going to do in the darks, because that mostly will solve it for me. Right now, it's which method do I use to begin to add what I would call some of the details of this drawing. What I usually do, because it's one of my favorite techniques to go to, and it's pretty much how I mostly, once I'm here and I have a visual sense of it, is the blind contour. And it's not 100% blind, meaning I'm not never looking at my paper, although I love that one. And I would absolutely do this same sketch on a sketchbook, completely blind contour, see what happens. But so I'm going to be about 90, 95% on my subject to that 5-10% on my paper. And again, that's to make sure we're getting the lines and the angles and the perspectives somewhat in the right place, but with a little more looseness. What I recommend here is a little more looseness. I'm going to do one final touch because I want to get the sense of the tree here that I want to add. So this one's going to be closer to us, and how close to the edge am I going to be here? So I know it's going to be about this tall, and I'm just doing a little quick, just a little quick pattern of lines here to get a sense of its placement. No detail at all. No light, there we are. And I might add a second one here that is going to be closer to the edge and maybe off the page, giving me a little bit of support for this area here. And then of course we have some here in the background. I'll play with that as well. Not concerned about this area here so much. And then I'll deal with the front, which I know has somewhat more perspective. So I have two pens here. I have actually three: the brush, a 05, and a 03. My first one will be the 05, my thicker outer edge lines. And I'm going to start over here on the left. And I want to make sure I get closer and closer looks at some of those details and how I'm going to begin to add the patterns of my lines. So for the first part, I will confirm what I feel is the outer edge, the contour, the silhouette of this building. I will save, and I'm going to be patient to save some of these lines that should not be done with this pen because it's a little bit thicker. And some of the lines that I would consider for this area back here, because they get smaller and smaller, should be with a thinner pen. But I'm looking at these bigger, thicker structural lines and the way they curve all the way around the building. No need for much fancy work in terms of patterns of lines. I am going to darken some of them as I see them. So I'm doing a little bit of parallel. It's not filling. I'm doing semi-horizontal, or in this case, a semi-diagonal parallel hatching that is very thin, and it's only like a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Because I do see somewhat those darks. I want to make sure I'm putting them in. I continue, and I really want to pay attention to how these lines wrap around and give us that sense of what the building, what they're doing in relationship to this building, to the structure of it. There we are, and how they're divided and how they have some, and again, these are all architectural lines that we would look at. It's nice, and I know they have names for some of these columns and the breaks between this and the ridges right above. But my concern is mostly with the form of it. So as my line gets closer to me, it stops being so round and becomes a little bit flatter. It doesn't wrap around as much. And I want to make sure I follow. So it was a good idea to have these. There we are. Now there's a lot of interesting things happening here. And you want to, again, pay attention to multiple things. The perspective of it is going to be crucial. So always stop yourself before you consider any variation on the edge of this side, for example. simplify it as simple shapes like we did before. So it's a cube. If you can see the edge of it, you can see it as a cube. Break it down into, again, in not many cases, cylinders. Almost everything becomes cube as I see it over this side, and they're broken. But you can literally see the perspective of it. And we will be figuring out how that perspective is working within the building. And if you remember, I showed you those lines that go from the arches, and the perspective of those arch lines that are all pointing to that vanishing point. We can figure it out, and I want you guys to really begin to see it, because they don't go to the horizon line. Since they're different levels, they're going to have their own horizon line that is just at the edge, almost at the edge between one level and the next. And that's the beauty of it. If you can find it and make sure all the lines are following that, it will look beautiful. So here I'm going to have consideration for, again, some of the types of lines that I'm going to be working with, and I don't want to make them. So I'm thinking more of preservation of your whites in this case. You don't want to draw lines over areas that you don't want them to be, because you need that, they're going to be overlapping. So make sure that you're seeing ahead. So I kind of want to define this area here, and I'm paying close attention. So it's more of a intuitive. Since I have some of these marks here, I'm confident. I'm making them a little bit darker. And I see the perspective. So there's my perspective. And I begin to add carefully some of those patterns of lines. In this case, I did a little bit of, let's call it a parallel hatch, scumbling parallel hatch, because it was sort of scumbly, but it was in a sort of a pattern that just took care of that right there. That makes me happy. So I'm also going to begin to make relationships. So I see how this edge moves into the second arch here and gives me just enough space that is almost vertical. Much more vertical than the previous. And there's also some perspective. And there's breaks. So here, I'm going to do a little stippling. And in many ways, I could be showing this angle as well if we switch. And I don't know how good this is going to look, but let's try it. So I could be switching cameras here and show you that, for example, in this area here where I see some break and rock, obviously there's broken lines, but I could begin to use stippling. And this is where your drawing begins to develop depending on how much love and patience you put into it. I'm combining a little bit of, if you notice, stippling and somewhat of scumbling, like very delicate. It's almost like broken stippling into scumbling, if you could see that. That just kind of disappears right into that perspective. I do a little bit of dashing. So it's a multitude of all of these combinations of lines and patterns of lines that you can begin to put together. And when you see them all combined, that's when it becomes very satisfying. So I'll keep that here for our next shot. And then I'm going to move from this area here. And what I'm doing is I'm structuring. I started from the edge, moved to the middle, and now from the middle, I'm working my way up to this area so I could begin working within. Okay, so I see another angle here, and all I'm going to do is check that angle, and I see that it comes at the second column, so this would be 1 right here, so right about here. And making a quick eyesight here, that brings it to here, so right about here. And we're lining it up with the third column. So this gives me this line. I check my angle, bring it down, and it actually matches. So there we go. And again, I'm going to consider as much as I can, get a close look. One thing I do want is to check that perspective. And if in doubt, exaggerate just a bit instead of straightening. That fear of not having it right and the tendency to straighten it out hurts your drawing more than if you were to exaggerate. So here I'm going to use a kind of a different pattern of lines. Let's see if you guys could see that. And I'm going right over here in this area. So for this area here, this is where I would probably switch my pen, and I should have them so I could switch back and forth. Because of the angle, I'm actually using somewhat of a wavy to maintain that perspective line, kind of a broken parallel hatch. So it's a little bit of line dot, if you guys could see it. It's not just stippling. And I'm maintaining the angle of the line just to add some of those line dot, line dot. And again, this is very intuitive. It's not like you could really plan every single line or dot. You're pretty much doing it as you go. But I think it gives you a really good sense right there of how it begins to come together. There we are. And as I move up, I keep the same pen, the smaller. Make this a little bit darker, so just a little bit of cross hatch as it gets away from us. And then we move to the top. And I'm beginning to use a little more and more patterns of line. In that case, it was parallel, just parallel hatch, meaning a lot of little vertical lines next to each other. And then for our final one, it's already set. So I just bring this down. My perspective is there, bring this down. And then a combination of lines. In this case, I want to make them look like bricks. So it's these, again, parallel. And again, it's more of a diagonal following the line of perspective hatch. Break them down a little bit so it's variation, giving you that feel of rock or brick that's here at the top. And slowly but surely, it's coming together. So from this point, boy, do we have a lot of area to cover. I should maybe begin to consider going a little bit faster. So I'm going to look at a little bit of these details here. Oops. I'm going to make this big for a second so we could get a closer look, because I'm looking at this top area and just how I can capture the look of some of these ornaments up here and the shape of them. And I'm looking more at the shape of the shadow. So light and shadow, I'm looking at the shape, I'm looking at the distance, I'm seeing if I can connect any patterns and begin to do that and work my way from the top to the bottom. So bring it back here. And what I see is it's kind of a general line, so I'm giving myself some dots that will kind of align. Zoom in a little bit for you guys and maybe work this area here. So if you notice, I gave myself a couple of little dots here. And what I want to do now is focus on the shape of some of these shadows. You could, if you wanted to, like I did before, count them and make sure as they get closer to the center, they become bigger. And they have this roundness that almost insinuates the edge and the edge around it. So I'm doing a little bit of parallel hatch, but it's very, very tight. It's almost like a filling combined with stippling as they get smaller and smaller. And again, as I always recommend, The illusion of detail is actually what creates a great drawing. Adding the detail and too much focus on wanting to add the detail forces you to do a different type of drawing. I'm not saying you can't. It is a beautiful style, that kind of architectural, engineering-like drawing. I think they're actually a little bit longer and dealing a little bit more with perspective. So I'm adding just a couple of 1, 2, 3 lines in a parallel hatch. So have the freedom, what I was saying earlier, have the freedom to play with the lines, look for ways to create that illusion without necessarily feeling that urge to have to draw the actual detail that you're seeing. It's better if you just capture the illusion of it. And with these marks, you can. And as you play with them and discover, and I'm going to get a little more intuitive here. So as I see, and again, this is where I begin to get a little more blind contour, because I have guides, I have a sense. So I'm looking at my subject and I'm squinting and I'm looking for those dark areas, and I can spot them with all the information that I have. And if you notice, let me switch camera, see if you guys could see it here. If you notice, in this area here, I'm basically just following, keeping my eye on the subject mostly in 98, 99%, and I'm adding just lines, and most of it is just stippling. And from here on out, this is basically how this drawing is going to go. I'm just adding dots and dots and dots, and beginning to see how this comes together is the beauty. Now, some of these lines, and here you have to be very cautious how you're going to use some of these, because this is where the illusion of detail comes together. And what I say by that is, when I add too many of these lines, and remember, as they get farther away, they get smaller and tinier. So it could be just dots, and it could be some of the lightest dots you can do. And as they get closer to us, they become more linear, fuller, or maybe even thicker. Thicker to the point where you can actually switch a pen. And just by adding a few of these dots and lines here and there, I want you to see what happens to an area like this. So that close-up look gives you this. And as you notice, oh, wow, if I were to add just anything, any tiny little touch there, it has enough information to deliver what I want to create, which is that illusion of, yeah, that's the top of the Coliseum. Maybe a couple of vertical lines here and there would do the job too. And my caution to you here is careful with overdoing it. Pace yourself until you have that confidence that you know why you're just adding dots or lines to that area. Because once you add one too many, you'll see it. You're, oh, okay, something happened here. Yep, that's going a little bit beyond what you should have, by maybe not considering or being aware of why you were adding it, and or maybe a little bit of patience. So I'm adding a little bit as I squint and see this dark area. I'm just adding a little tiny pattern of crosshatch, and I'm going to add one up here too. And it's a parallel hatch, just parallel hatch, sort of in a diagonal way. And you see what begins to happen to the light, to the illusion of what we did with that cylinder earlier. An area that gets a little bit darker here. And I could actually go area by area and bring this down here and here. And it goes all the way into here, beautifully actually. And when I overlap some of these parallel hatches with a little bit of crosshatch, or maybe just a second layer of parallel hatch right over it, you can really begin to feel like you're creating that feel for that structure, the actual texture of it, what it's supposed to look like. The illusion in your eye as how you see it becomes revealed. You begin to see it and wonder, oh, wow, how did I decipher that? Because the application of those lines and the result, one word, intuitive. And I say it again and again. Play, 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 discover. Slow yourself down. In some cases, I'm careful to say slow down because it's not always slow down. Sometimes you have to be more gestural. But in this case, slow yourself down. I'm going into a little scumbling here at the bottom because I see some of these plants, like flower beds, a little bit right into this arch here. And that actually plays really well, I think. Let me maybe switch to this camera over here so you guys could see it. As I do that, and that would be, notice how I'm in this area here, just scumbling. And I break scumbling into dashes, dots, but I want to go very slow. And as I go away from it, it's getting thinner and slower and always playful and not overdone. A couple dots just to reiterate some things here. Not too many. That's it. So that gives me the base and the edge at the bottom. There it is. And let's get back to, I think, something I've been avoiding for too long, the arches. And I'm going to go right into them, give myself a little read here into the second, because you have these beautiful, and give it a second line. Just for that little bit of dark. And this one in the middle, as it gets wider to the edge. And then one at the top. So I'm still looking for those major landmark, in this case, breaks of the line that would identify easier where I'm going to be placing some of these elements. As I begin to do my column work, I want to kind of break down this, and this would not be a straight line. This is the one I was talking about earlier, where you don't want to do a line that you then have to deal with, and it wasn't supposed to be continuous, because you're going to be juxtaposing it. You're going to be putting it over something that was clear. So I see these patterns here, and very carefully here, I want to make sure I got this, and this is right next to the edge. So my column is going to go right about here, and I'm doing my first one right down to the edge, and this is it. I have a little bit of a bottom, kind of like a concrete, that takes me right into this column here. And the way we place these and add our lines to it is going to make all of the difference here. Some of these lines that give us that brick texture. But again, you do not have to just follow these. You can be creating pretty much your own patterns of lines. So I'm going to go right into this one because I'm following this, and I'm going to work my way all the way around. This one that takes me right into this arch here, and see how far and how big this should be. This follows here. So we're right about there. And this arch that goes right here. And obviously, there's a lot of dark. Find my perspective line. And for now, I am just going to create a hatch. I don't want to color this in, meaning like a coloring book, make it all black. I want to see some variations. So that's why I do a parallel hatch, and I did one right over it and have some of this texture. In this case, I'm doing, when in doubt, stippling is your answer, meaning dots begin to show you a little bit how the texture should be resolved in that area. Especially when you're dealing with rock. Very easy. There we go. And this lines up perfectly right there with our second arch here. Just a little bit above. This one goes right below, right there. And again, just for accuracy, I'm saying how these are going to work out. Maybe went too far. And how high? It goes a little bit higher. And there's a way to really capture arches. There's a geometric, but again, time consuming, more of an engineering approach, geometric approach to deliver an arch with accuracy, and I mean the roundness of it. So this one again begins to have that line, the perspective that goes just a bit outside of it and runs right into here, just like that. And these, we could see the lines of perspective a little more this way and how it just begins to overlap. And I'm doing a little bit of parallel zigzagging, kind of, right into the back edge to create that arch. Oh gosh, did we switch up? Okay. And I do have to switch a camera really quick. And there we are. Oh boy. Here we go. Okay, let me check. There we are. Switch it up a little bit. Okay. All right, moving along. Just switching it up a little bit into more of a blind contour drawing in order for me to catch up with you guys. I'm going to loosen up my line. I think I've been way too trying to be a little too precise. I'm going to follow up some of these lines that I have here already and kind of loosen up my line. Switch my pen actually. So we go into the outer edges and make sure at the edges here I have just the right angles, kind of following a blind contour approach, and how this rounds all the way back. And just some soft lines that will allow me to show that. And how it rounds from here to the edge. Notice that my line is not becoming as stiff. I actually like these better. It is my natural way. I'm going to add a little bit of dark pattern here as I see perspective lines identified and parallel patterns here. So your parallel hatch pretty much solves it almost always. If in doubt, stippling, like I said, scumbling really gets you there. And then you begin to consider cross hatching, line and dot. A lot of line and dot for this one, I think. We're actually coming through with it. Coming across. And we see another ridge here that comes right across. And I'm going to begin to insinuate some of these lines as we get closer and closer to the finish line. So that could do it for now. Let me go back to this area. And just, I'm going to begin to add my columns and my arches as I saw them with my markers. So I'm going to add a couple of lines just to guide. And I don't want them to go all the way to the top because there's the ornaments here. The 3 different type of columns that are represented in the Colosseum to honor the Greeks. And I am going to share a video with you guys in the email that I think you guys will enjoy. It's also from a channel that I really enjoy. You guys can find a lot of, and sometimes it's a little heavy in information, stuff that makes you wonder, okay, why do I need to know that? I'm not a archaeology or art history PhD, but some amazing facts that you can actually, just to take this a little bit further. There we are. So these columns will pretty much solve if they follow the markers that I had with a little bit of accuracy and maintain that I'm squinting, checking mostly, not so much what's happening with the line, but with the values, the darks and lights. Obviously with the angles as they shorten or get narrower. And I'm going to give myself just enough space for that size of the arches as they become sharper and sharper, going away from us. And I'm just going to add these lines and then touch up with the ornaments. This requires a little bit of very tough to do blind contour. So I am getting the best read I can from that angle and trying to place it according to the study, the analysis that I did earlier. And as it comes together, I'm just placing these as guiding lines so I could come back and be more confident when I add the final details. But I'm still eyes on my subject, trying to get the best possible read of anything I missed earlier. And also the columns, as they pull away further and further, they get thinner and thinner until we don't see them. And they're almost overlapping one another. So I think that does it right there. And at this point, anyone could say, oh, hey, that's the Colosseum. Pretty sure that would happen. So we should be happy if we're anywhere near here. So far, so good. Now, I think this is the tricky point. How do I develop these arches? with the confidence. So I'm giving myself, there's a little bit of space right above it. And I'm going to make us a visual. I want to see that line where all the top of the arches kind of curve away. Make sure I have that. There is an angle if I place my pencil or my pen right above the edges. And there it is. And from there, I just want to make sure I get the edges, because I noticed that at the side of every column, there's somewhat of an edge, like the side of the column as it leans into the wall. And again, knowing that as they get further away, they're going to become thinner and thinner. And I just round as if I were doing a semicircle. Actually, almost you're trying to do a circle at the top to connect those lines. So let me do it again. I have a line at either side of the column, and then from the top, I just round and round right into that line. And I will worry about the perspective of those arches as I develop them individually. But just rounding it, it almost gives you the automatic perspective if you follow that rule. So what I did is I gave myself a nice ghost line, basically, of lining up all those arches. And I'm giving myself the sides of the columns and then just rounding the top right into those lines. And if you had everything set up like that, they pretty much come together very easily. I always forget to check. I'm checking the chat. Any questions? None. So everybody must be doing amazing, because I see a lot of focus on the screen. So here the arches begin to get way sharper and sharper as they come into the line until they literally disappear. And they just become this dark mass, which again, I don't want to just fill up. But that, I think, came out and worked out well. Now the angle of the the second level arches, I'm going to find the first one, and I can visualize the space between the top ridge here and the column, which is just a little bit less. And it follows just pretty much the same pattern. And I think that will do it. And I'm going to do the same thing for the third now. The third is a little bit of a sharper angle, but since I have that angle there already, it should, once I have that measurement, it should just follow the same. And there we go. Now, I see it and it follows the same decorative pattern, which is side of the column, and then I just round my circle right into those lines. And I'll do it again, checking for the measurement. Here it's almost sideways, so it rounds right into the edge. And as it continues, I'm pretty sure that will happen. This one disappears. This one, I see it from the inside, almost the corner. So I want to make sure I mark that, because that line is going to be my perspective line. And if you can see it, it goes this way. And all of these lines are pulling right towards the same vanishing point. Can you see those? So all these lines are not independent. They all eventually will meet at the same vanishing point. Same with these over here. Now these are a little bit tougher because they're lower level, so they're more level with our eye. They're trickier. They have a separate vanishing point, and I'm going to leave those for last. We begin to add more. And this one pretty much disappears right into it. So all we see is the side. This one, we don't even see it. Same here. And just with that curvature, developed. And then final level, we don't have one here. And this is the Corinthian style column. So I have that, and then I have my distance from the column into the arch. Same. They kind of follow the same pattern all the way through, although here it begins to disappear and go right into the edge. As we see more and more. There we are. I'm guessing if it's okay with everybody, I hope so, we can go till 12:30. If you guys give me a nod, I hope nobody has to leave early. Yay, thumbs up, I see. Good. Okay, so let's keep going. And at this stage is where we're almost, so I'm sorry if I took too long. I'm trying to go a little bit slower, so if anybody needs kind of, I don't get it, I want to see, I want to follow, I'm slowing it down in terms of the structure of the drawing. I generally would do this a lot. I don't want to say faster, but more intuitive approach with a lot of simultaneous structure and texture line work combination. So that's where I'm going to be now. Now that I have all of this, I am going to bring this back up. So you don't forget that where we are and where we want to be, somewhere near. Obviously, these are completely dark, and I don't want to just do that. But overall, to have a general, notice that if we were to look at this image, let me actually click on this one so I can make this one way bigger. If we were to look at this image, notice that we could actually match some of the textures in those darks. And it actually reveals itself as some clumps of stippling, some of the lines, some of the patterns, some of the cross hatching, and where you would put it, especially on the outer rock, on the face of some of these columns and ridges between the columns, or the different darks. And I want to point out, between the levels. And visualizing this and somewhat this front entrance here. This is, I guess, that's the north view. Maybe actually it's more of the or western, I'm thinking. Anyways, how a lot of these darks could be developed, and this is giving you the answer. Now, this is a stage where you do not want to rush. You really want to stop, analyze, and for example, I'm picking this area here. If I'm looking at this notan, and the first thing I see is something I was not seeing in the earlier one, a little bit of darker patterns here. How is that helping me? If I were to go into this area here, I begin to notice breaks. And the thing I want to point out the most is I don't want to be at this point just eyes fixed on my paper. I want to maintain that relationship to my subject, looking, then eyes on my paper to create my pattern, then check it again, then come back and add another pattern, and not just eyes on the paper adding patterns with you losing track of what what actually should be happening according to your subject. And the light, in this case, the lights and textures as you see them on or in this image transfer to your paper. So here's where we could get carried away, and notice that I just kind of did with just adding lines all over the place, with losing a little bit of that analysis that we've been doing all along and kind of coloring in. So here you want to, once again, I don't say slow down in terms of work real slow, but more analytical. Don't lose all of the stuff you worked up right to this far and then overcook it, would be the best way to say it. So be cautious. It's smelling delicious, and you should keep your eye on it. And overcooking it is, it's not difficult. It happens very easily. So that's going to be my main point to make from here on out. How far is too far? What kind of lines and why? If I go back and forth, what do I still need to look for? So I think I'm going to get rid of it again and come back to our, and notice that when you have them side by side, I wanted to point this out as well. Isn't it interesting that when you look at both of them, if you were to look side by side, when you look at the notan, doesn't it look like you could read the perspective a little bit easier? When you look at the one in color, which is how we're used to seeing things, it looks like it's standing up a little straighter. But if you look at the notan, you can actually see the tilt of the perspective. And again, that's how we want to really see in order to transfer to the paper what we actually, the information that we actually need to focus on. So sometimes the color and the structure and the familiarity of something we know, and we know what it's supposed to look like, could be lost. It's that little lack of attention because we think we know what it looks like that can actually, I don't want to say hurt your drawing, but yeah, it would get you to that stage where something can happen that won't make you happy. Okay. So I was talking about the arches, and I should finish the ones on the side. And again, I have plenty of information to just go ahead and do that. A little more intuitive. And at this point, I am just going to go with a lot of the line patterns that we were talking before. And as you can see, it's going to be a lot of parallel hatching. I am using the thinner pen right now, the 03, and I'm breaking some of these parallel hatches into somewhat of a line dot pattern where I identify brick and the difference from brick to rock. A lot of fine work here because there's a little bit of fine line with these lines of brick. So you want to slow down and make sure you get a lot of this consistent in terms of length and distance. And these are some of the rich areas that will pop in your drawing when you slow down and actually do something very intentional. They will literally stand out and be very strong. So as I finish this front, more stippling and parallel variations of that, knowing that it repeats at the top and then down here. There we go. Couple of elements, and I don't want to add every single detail. That's the key here too. Knowing that if you had 10 things, when you added in a 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, 5, you're already pushing it. There's no need to go 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And sometimes you feel like you have to go beyond the 10 to 12, 13 in order to get that 10 detail. With 1, 2, 3, you could be already there. And I mean that by lines. Sometimes 1, 2, 3 lines or dots can give you the sensation, that illusion that we're trying to create, that would be generally captured with 10. You're better off holding on to economy of line. And again, I'm doing a lot of squinting again on this side, making sure I got the right read. I'm going to do a little bit of what I did on the other side, which is read some of these arches here. Coming right into the gutter of my sketchbook. My perspective line here. And a lot of this, in this case, crosshatch. So begin to analyze how you're using the combination of lines. Are you doing all parallel? Are you doing all of it crosshatch? Are you doing all of it scumbling? And I can't wait to get to that part. But a mixture of all of them. And if so, why and where? What is it that you're looking for? And is it working? Is that the right one for this area here? Could it be mixed? Could it be simplified? Could maybe be a different one? And it's amazing how just, again, an area of thousands of bricks right here, just 10 lines, give you that sensation. And again, not even 10 lines, 10 dots, because that was 10 dots. We continue. And what I want to do here is, again, do what I did on the other side, which is identify the top. This is a little trickier because it goes a little bit lower, and there's a lot of diagonal lines that I'm calling vertical, top to bottom, that would be crossed over. So I don't want to do that because it will create that sensation. So I kind of want to go more vertical in order to create that line that just comes straight down. And again, I don't want to mix it with what's going on right here in the middle. But I did say I'm going to go a little more intuitive here on this side. And it's not just to rush it, but to loosen up. And in the end, this will be a beautiful page. We did take our time. And we have so many varieties of line. We paid so much attention to the accuracy that it will be a tough one when considering color. And if so, how much? Because the line work is so rich already. I have my markers where I'm doing this, but I'm also looking and one final one right there at how it's curving away. And that should give me a good read so far for how these arches just go into the curve. Now I want to make sure I got the angle. Just a variation into the edge, right about there. And then the pattern, which goes right into the column. So curve it into this one, curve it into here. Same. And I will find those perspective lines. And it gets sharper and sharper until it disappears. And I think we got it there. There's a couple of, and again, I'm making a little bit thicker, darker stippling here as it goes away. And I'm going to add a couple of vertical parallel hatches here that identify that as brick. And don't get too mechanical would be one thing when adding those lines. Rhythmic, yes. Mechanical, no. Unless mechanical is what you're looking for. And what I mean by that, it's you could literally, someone can figure out your pattern. It was dot, 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 even the tempo of it. You want to kind of create the nice rhythm, break it up. So again, it's intentional. Because that's where we usually get caught up. We start doing lines, lines, and all of a sudden we're like just going off, and we stop thinking why or when I should stop. So it's a difficult thing to control. It comes with practice. Best recommendation I can give you is slow it down. Be aware. So we're at the top of this one, and as it goes away, it sharpens a lot more. There we are. And there's a little bit, it goes right into the column. So because this is the inner ring of the Colosseum, it's a different look from the exterior. I'm loosening up my line. I'm making it a little more personal. And that's in the recap you'll see today. All of these things that we're doing today is to give you a sensation of how do I develop the Kathy line, the Gretchen line. Oh my God, look at that Chris line. That's a Chris line. And Deb and Ann, we're seeing the line that we can tell you. Diane, I already know the Diane line. So it's how do I make all of these mine? These are mine, and this is how I do them, I make them. If I missed someone, I didn't mean to. It's who I'm seeing on screen. I know there's maybe more, but you guys know what I mean. It's eventually having a full sense of control over these lines that before you do them, you know what they're going to look like. And that's a great feeling. And I always say it, it's almost best explained by how we speak. Most people you know can actually, hopefully, you know, they can anticipate your state of mind and how you're going to speak just by knowing you. And it's your tone of voice, your language, your vocabulary. With lines, it's the same way. You have to make them yours. And remember, it's what you're trying to say, how you're trying to say it with lines. So having a sense of that is crucial. So I'm making a measurement here, 1, 2, 3. Kind of lost this area here, right in the gutter. And making a nice, quick parallel hatch to explain that there. The brick that goes around it, making a cross hatch. And not just to darken areas because they need to be dark, fill them in. No, you want to play with it. Maybe do stippling, scumbling, play with different variations of them. And then this one, 1, 2, 3, has this circular. So we're going to begin to work with some of these perspectives inside the arches. And I was mentioning these right here. So I could easily see that this one goes right there. And it curves right into the back. This one, we could still see the edge. Vertical, following the same line. This one begins to get closer and closer until, again, I want to have that vanishing point and the level. This one disappears right into it. This one doesn't These almost don't even matter because they will be pretty much in the shadow. I want to make sure I have the columns touched up all the way to the top as ornaments. So I'm beginning to use some of that scumbling, a little more rigid because they're still kind of geometric. I'm following the arches here to create some of that shadow that's inside the arches by parallel hatching. I still pay close attention to my subject. I don't want to just start coloring it in. I'm going to add variations where I see them to create that illusion. That's what we're doing. Here we begin to see more and more brick. It's actually more like marble. And how it goes from dark, and again, I'm doing very, very tight, very close parallel hatching that then widens. And this parallel hatching is in a curve, following the curve of that arch. And here I have a lot more distance between the lines. And I could switch up to this close up here so you guys could see that. So as I do these, my parallel hatch follows the line of the perspective. And this one here, I'm just adding the brick. I go to scumbling, some stippling, and here it goes from, this is completely dark. So I'm doing a parallel hatch that overlaps, not a cross hatch, and it's just gonna kind of fill in the area. But here, as I look at it, it follows the arch, the angle of it, and I create first a parallel hatch that then I overlap in the same curvature, and here it begins to widen and shorten. And now I'm cross hatching. Maybe add 1 or 2 lines down here just to create that variety. And at the top, I have these that are on the facade, creating that brick illusion. I have a little bit of shadow underneath this column, and then the column itself. Add a couple more lines to this one here, and a little more shadow underneath. Same here, a little more shadow, parallel hatch, tiny, tiny little dots to the column, almost a scumbling, add some shadow, and then the same. This is completely dark. And if we look up close, there is kind of like a gate, but we don't want to add that information there. I just want to make sure. I go into, once again, a little bit of stippling, following the line. And now I go into the arch. So I just follow that curvature and then sharpen the angle at the top. The bricks right at the top, make them a little bit thinner, more defined because they're getting closer to us. So the closer things are to us, the more refined we see the detail. The farther away, the blurrier, smaller, and even lighter. Let me switch camera again. I hope that was helpful. And it's just a little quick breakdown of how all of these areas can be just touched up with a few tiny little combination of lines. And this stage right here, from here on out, very intuitive, making sure you're still following all the rules of perspective that you set up is the key, even with your patterns of lines. So let me switch one more time to show the last one here. And this one here, we're doing, let me switch the camera right there so you guys can see clearer, almost from my point of view, right there. So we're working on this one. And as I said, a parallel hatch that makes this darker. And then as I look at my subject, there's some information there. There's some shadow right underneath this division from the wall to the top of the arc here. And I want to follow, in this case, I have this line, so I could follow it this way and follow that same perspective into the arch. And notice that I should follow it downwards, but it's not straight lines. It's more of a brick. It could be dots. And then I create a hatch, cross hatch in this case, that opens up a little bit and gives me that sensation to a little bit of a very light hatch broken up here. A little bit of outer brick, a little bit shadow at the top. And there we are. So if you remember those drawings we saw earlier, when you looked at all those lines put together, combined, this is the kind of feel you want to have when you look at, okay, that, and again, it could be more planned. And step away so we can go back to this view. Wow, so considering this a sketch, it's actually becoming way more a drawing. And this is usually what would take, if you're doing an hour, hour and a half, 2 hour. I could take this maybe into a 4 or 5 hour drawing now with the meticulous type of line work that you would have to add in order for this to be consistent all the way through. One key here is not to lose focus, not to get lazy. And I mean that in a way where you just start zigzagging lines, filling in. But you want to keep that playful sensation of all the things you could do with variations of lines, with the pace, rhythms, directions, thickness, thinness, and I just can't think of any more, but all the possibilities. By playing with contrast, by omitting, that's another way, omitting some of the details that you don't think need to be in there. You get to make that decision. So I'm going to add a little bit of pattern here because I think this area here needs a little bit of visual break. And it's not just light and shadow. It needs a little bit of lines. And in this case, following the perspective again, diagonal lines. They're just single lines, dots and lines that follow that pattern. And what it is kind of visualizing the break between the marble, the break between the bricks here and there. Going a little bit into what different variations can I do to this part of the wall, and then finish up these arches down here. I kind of want to do the top first because it will be pretty much finished at the top. And again, here's a same example. Do not want to lose track of your main structural lines of perspective when you're adding all these little lines, because visually they could throw it off. And what I'm doing now is looking for that perspective line inside the arch. I could see it, I could see the vanishing point, and there it is. And I notice the thickness, and I see how much of the inside I could see, and then follow that same line, and again, and I have this point in mind. I do not want to lose it. There we go. As we get further away, it kind of loses its value a little bit. We don't see the inside anymore, so it's not as important. There we are. And we will follow the same rule here, where I just follow the shape of that arch with a nice pattern of line, giving it that curvature so it's easily read, and then followed down with a nice parallel hatch. Just a couple of cross, in this case, it's somewhat of a grid to give you that sensation of the direction. Adding a little bit of cross hatch and parallel hatch as I look at the shadows inside of it. And then visually, boom, there's the illusion. Having a little bit of read of what's going on down here. I want to finish them up. So this, I go back to drawing, and I begin to add my lines and patterns, mostly stippling. As I said, this pretty much solves it. When in doubt, stippling gets you there pretty close. More parallel. Paying close attention to the difference in value and I'm going to minimize somewhat the detail up here, because with that much change in contrast, there is not that much, you don't need that much detail to finish telling that story there. It's pretty much all there. Notice how my hand gets a little bit looser. Going to the bottom. Looking at value. Patterns of lines. Into the arches. Same thing. This is where I pay close attention. We have our center one, and then this one. I want to identify that perspective, which is tricky because it's almost eye level. So these are the ones that can cause trouble. I find the thickness and then the arch. There it is. Maintain that perspective line. Find that thickness. And then the arch. And we follow it all the way through. As they get a little bit thicker, and the arch becomes sharper and sharper. I'm going to play a little bit with the variation of parallel hatching here, whereas you can see I'm making them way wider to medium to very thin to gone, completely overlapping. And that would be right here, where it almost feels like I'm just filling it in. But again, you want to maintain that arch. And this one here, it just goes right in. And everything else is brick. Going to stippling, because I don't want to overdo it with information. Knowing that that would be maybe too much. Going a little bit to scumbling for the upper detail. A little bit of a repetitive pattern here that I got to be careful with. That's what I meant by mechanical, where you're not even thinking about it and you're just adding it because you've done it before. So you want to be careful with that. And I say this again, looking at the value of it. I get to an area where I can literally scumbling, which is one of my favorites. And I break the line. Do some grids, parallel hatching, and go from one to the other with ease. Knowing that this is the area and exactly what it needs right then and there. And I begin to just maneuver and get into an intuitive state that is very satisfying, because you could literally get lost in this place where you're there. You're literally one with the rock. And it shows in your drawing. It literally shows. It's almost like you were there touching it, getting the full sensation of the light and what it's doing to it. You could feel the texture. Therefore, you can just put it on the paper. And that's kind of the feel you want to have always. What it feels like and how it would be transferred. Looking at the light in this one, and this one just following, curving, parallel hatch all the way through the top. A little bit of a curvature to the arch here that would take us into this darker area. There's a shadow back there. Squinting reveals it. A little bit of a zigzag grid there. I'm going to overlap this cross hatch just to give it that nice, rich shadow. A little bit of a zigzag again, maybe some scumbling, create that visual interest there. And now for the arch, I'm going to try to recreate that very tight brick line work in the perspective. More stippling and cross hatching. And with that, I am done with this side. So I'm going to place most of my focus, as we did on this side. As I move along, I'm going to do less and less detail. So I'm going to focus more because there's so much information here. If I make this, it becomes one of those architectural drawings. So here I want to make a little more artistic rendering, more gestural. Maybe it would be nice to just go into some of that intuitive, stippling, scumbling, cross pattern, and a lot of focus on the values. So I'm paying close attention to the difference, and it is a lot brighter on this side. That stone, it's almost whiter in this area. And how I can play with the difference between that and the dark inside our arches here. So I'm doing parallel hatching almost all the way through and revisiting. I don't want to do it all at once. I want to make sure I got the bottom of these arches first as I follow my guidelines that were there before. Oh, Diane needed to leave. I wanted to see before you guys left. Oh, and Chris is leaving too. Okay, so hopefully you guys will post them on Facebook, because I really, really want to see what you guys did with these lines. It is 12:30 already. Oh my gosh. So actually, you know, I'm going to pause here. And I got to say, getting a little bit better at timing. Whoops, not a good one today. This is one of those classes, again, that could be 4 hours, because this almost could turn into that. It could have been a 10, 15-minute drawing, but it could easily have gone into a 4-hour, 5-hour drawing. And it looks like it might need another hour or half hour at least. So I'm going to pause here. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was fun, but I really want to see what you guys have so far before we conclude. So